Hello, everyone. My name is Patricia Daly. I am Professor of the Human Geography of Africa in the School of Geography and the Environment. I'm also Vice Principal and Fellow and Tutor in Geography at Jesus College. I've been teaching in the Geography Department at Oxford since 1991. Prior to that, I taught at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire in the USA and at Loughborough University. And yes, I'm quite old. I'm not sure how, I can't move my slides on. Okay, there's a delay. Okay, so how did I become a geographer? Thinking back, it was probably because I liked traveling to new places and learning about them. And I loved especially being in mountains, the landscape where I feel most comfortable. And for my first degree at Middlesex Polytechnic, now university, I studied for a BSc in geography with geology as my second subject. My undergraduate dissertation was on a plant ecology conservation topic. So I was really very much a physical geographer as an undergraduate. After my first degree, I trained as a geography teacher. And whilst teaching in London, I became interested in Africa when I took an evening class on African women's writing. That spurred me on to do a master's degree in African studies at SOAS and a PhD in geography at Oxford, specializing in refugee migration in East Africa. And here you can see photos from my research site, in Katumba, which is in the west of Tanzania. And these photos were taken in 2016. And I've been going back to that site to continue with the research I started in the 1980s. My research interests have largely been in African political geography, covering topics such as forced migration, political identities, citizenship, gender, and militarism. But my teaching has encompassed my broader interests that still include environmental issues, especially the human aspects of conservation and indigenous environment. As a Black scholar, I have been fascinated with racialization and colonialism, both in Africa and respect to the African diaspora. And the closest I've been to mountains is places like Simien Mountains National Park in Ethiopia. I have published widely on these issues, and my latest article in a geography journal is on how geographers have studied Black women's lives, especially what has been missing from those studies and what new approaches one might adopt. These interests inform my teaching. And let me now turn to the Oxford course and my contribution to it. I'll see if I can move that straight. The degree course is divided into two parts. The first year course known as prelims, and the second and third year course is together, we call the Honour School. Prelims consist of 4 papers that are examined at the end of the first year. The focus in these papers is on the fundamental concepts that underpin geographical knowledge and inquiry in physical and human geography. These are taught mainly in 2 papers, Human Geography and Earth Systems Processes. These papers are divided into 3 sections, and the lectures under each section are listed on the slide. And for the Human Geography paper, I lecture on different aspects of migration, and these are highlighted in red. So racialization and migration, borders on migration, and differentiated migrants. Through the Geographical Controversies paper, we introduce students and get them to examine debates and the importance of evidence in arguments. And recently, we've added the ethics of drone warfare, climate change controversies, roads must fall, and Black Lives Matter. Students get the opportunity to learn skills that are transferable, such as statistics, geographical information, and qualitative methods in our geographical techniques paper. And students also have the experience, get to experience field trips and these are examined at the end of the first year. Move on. In the second and third year course, known as the Honours School, students take 6 papers that are examined at the end of the third year. These consist of 1 compulsory paper, 2 foundational papers, and 3 optional papers. The compulsory paper is geographical thought. In this paper, students engage with the philosophical and methodological foundations of the discipline of geography, how they've changed over time, and how they inform how we practice geography. Lectures cover topics such as Darwinism, feminism, Marxism, postcolonialism, relationality, fieldwork, and policy impacts. And for this paper, I give a lecture entitled Institutional Subjects, examining who has been considered a geographer from the 19th century to the present, and emphasizing how gender and race have influenced how we perceive who can produce geographical knowledge and have informed what geographical questions are asked. You get to choose 2 of 3 foundational papers, and your choice can reflect the pathway you want to take through the degree, whether it's physical, human, or a mixed one. One of the foundational papers, Earth Systems Dynamic, and that's an advanced physical geography paper covering the scientific framework, concepts, and techniques that help us to understand the physical environment. The other paper, Environmental Geography, is a physical and human paper that addresses the causes and consequences of environmental issues and how we manage the environment. Lectures cover topics such as theories of environmentalism and the environment, environmental governance, environmental economics, climate change, resource extraction, and water and ocean resource management. And for this paper, I lecture on indigenous ontologies and conservation, looking at how indigenous people perceive and relate to nature and how these might conflict with dominant understandings about nature and nature conservation. The Space, Place and Society paper is the advanced human geography paper, again covering some of the, and developing some of the key concepts in geography, such as colonialism and anti-colonialism, geopolitics, consumption, development, gender, economic inequality, and digital infrastructures. And here I give a lecture on the politics of difference. In the third year, you will go on a field trip with members of your year group, and destinations in the last 3 years have been Berlin and Tenerife. In Berlin, topics to study include Holocaust Memorial, Cold War museums, Black geographies, and colonialism, as well as community gardening and techno music. You'll be expected to produce a 12,000-word dissertation on a topic of your choice, and some of the research skills that you've learned. And the topic of your dissertation could arise from something you've studied or that you've read about, so long as it's geographically relevant and will not put you in danger. You would choose 2 or 3 specialist optional papers from a list that will vary depending on the availability of tutors. And here you get a chance to learn from academics who are teaching specifically to their research interests. The options for the next 2 years are listed here. And as you can see, there's a mix of human and physical ones, from climate change and variability, desert landscapes and dynamics, geography at war, geographic data system, and finance and sustainability. And my option is in red, critical development geographies. For many years, I've taught a specialist option in African societies, but this autumn, I'll be co-teaching with my colleague, Dr. Amber Murray, a new option entitled Critical Development Geographies. The option will explore contemporary debates around development, issues of racialization, impoverishment, violence, South-South relations, and alternatives to Eurocentric development. My research and teaching interests have enabled me to straddle several subdisciplines and to shift my pathway that I've taken within the discipline. You can choose your own pathway through the subject, whether it be physical, human or environmental. I have really engaged in work that straddles several subdisciplinary areas of geography. And these are political geography, feminist geography, development geography, Black geographies, decolonial geographies, and political ecology. Through my research, I've also had an opportunity to engage with non-geographers in related fields. And I have taught and attended conferences in African studies, refugee studies, development studies, women's studies, and Black studies. I thoroughly enjoyed my career as a geographer and continue to find the subject fascinating, always changing, and increasingly relevant to understanding global, political, and environmental problems. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Patricia, for that. That was incredibly insightful. Now we're just on time, actually. So if we move on to the second academic presentation from Yadvinda, pass over to you. I think your camera, you're still on mute. Yeah, there we go.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, and welcome to this event. And I'm going to give a perspective more from the physical geography side on the different types of physical geography that are done within the department, what physical geographers do in terms of the research, and also then focus a bit more on my own research and also my pathway and my perspectives on being a British Asian geographer. And so click on this. So a little bit about me. I'm Professor of Ecosystem Science here at Oxford, and I coordinate the Oxford University Biodiversity Network as well. My pathway to geography has been very different from Patricia's, and it just shows you and highlights the number of ways that you can approach geography and do activity in geography. So I went to university and did physics because I thought I wanted to be an astronomer. But I always loved the natural world. I always loved being surrounded and working in the natural world, and realized in my undergraduate that physics involved a lot of staring at computer screens and being in labs, and realized that environmental science was far more appealing, where I could use my science skills but apply them to environmental challenges. And climate, this is the late 1980s, and climate change was emerging as an issue, and I thought this was a fascinating time to get into that topic. So after my physics degree, I did a PhD in meteorology and worked in West Africa, in Niger, looking at how desertification was causing changes in climate, how degradation of vegetation, whether it was causing changes in climate, and whether that was accelerating the process of desertification. The answer was no, it wasn't in the end, but it was an interesting and topical question at that time. So I spent a fair bit of time in West Africa, and also realized how much I enjoyed field work. I really loved getting out and solving problems day to day in the field and getting my equipment running, solving logistical issues, working with local partners and collaborators. And after my PhD, I then was offered a job on a very different area of the world to go to the Amazon rainforest and to build a tower in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, and then use my meteorology physics skills to try and measure how much carbon dioxide was being absorbed by the Amazon rainforest, and to see to what extent the Amazon was contributing to slowing down climate change by being this sink, this absorber of carbon dioxide. And that process involved me living on and off for 2 years in Brazil, in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon. And what I was fascinated at, as I was always looking at these maps of the Amazon and just seeing for 1,000 miles in every direction, just green blank, that there was so little known about this vast realm, this huge biological realm. And I realized how little we understood. We thought the world was mapped and understood, but actually how little we understood about the living world and how much more there was to discover. So that facilitated my conversion to being an ecologist when I was in the ecology department, and I became interested in the processes of life, how they interact, and how they're interacting with climate change. So the link was there to meteorology and to climate change. And gradually that brought me into geography. As well, I moved to Oxford in 2004 into the School of Geography, coming with this ecological background, but also finding that geography was also a natural home for this work, because I was interested in questions that involved space, it involved climate and biosphere and how it varied over space. Projects that were naturally interdisciplinary. And so, as well as being interested in ecology, I couldn't do what I was doing without understanding, on the physical side, climate, geomorphology, all these things. And actually, it was much more natural for me to be in a geography department than in an ecology or a plant sciences department. But more than that, physical geography is good at describing some of the challenges we face, but most of the answers to these challenges involve human geography, involving social geography, and understanding how people interact with the environment. And geography is also a natural place to understand those interactions between the physical and biological worlds and the human worlds, and the complexity of the interactions if we're trying to find solutions to that. So I would argue that the biggest challenge of our time is global change, climate change, biodiversity loss, these various agents of global change, and how we can reconcile being this expanding high consumption species on Earth with human concerns such as raising populations out of poverty and deprivation, increasing human welfare, while staying within the boundaries of a finite planet and not breaching the boundaries of climate change or other biodiversity loss and other biogeochemical boundaries. And I think these are the fundamental challenges of the 21st century, and geography is centrally positioned as being the subject that is well poised to address these challenges, because it naturally sweeps across the different aspects of the challenge, but also the solutions of the challenge that involve policy, involve understanding human behavior, understanding societies and how they function. So this is what I think makes geography a natural place to try and understand and tackle these major questions of our century. Before I go further into my research and my background there, I'll give a little overview of some snapshot of some of the other types of research that I've done under the ambit of physical geography in the departments. And so a few of my colleagues have sent me a few slides here just to give you a little bit of snapshot of the range of activities that go on, just to show you what goes on. And what is great about geography is there's so many different types of place that are involved and environments, and that's fascinating. So my colleague, Dr. Lisa Wedding, sent me a few slides describing her work on marine systems and how coral reefs are shifting under climate change. And she told me she did 2,000 dives for a PhD. I mean, I couldn't think of a more perfect way to spend a PhD, surveying marine systems in Hawaii and how they were changing over time, and linking that to remote sensing data and mapping patterns of change, and understanding how we can make coral reefs more resistant to climate change. And it works. Remote sensing is a core part of what many people in geography do. How can we link our site-based studies with the latest technologies, these multispectral, hyperspectral remote sensing approaches, to understand biology of the Earth's surface and how it's varying over time? And like many aspects of geography, one of the fascinating things is that it involves field work, but also it works working with other people in interesting places, and often with local students, local partners in many parts of the world, and that's one of the most enjoyable parts of this subject. As another example, a very different one, this is my colleague Nikita Zimov in the far northeast of Siberia. And what he's standing at is an area where the soil is eroding into a river in northeastern Siberia. And what you're seeing here are these dark Yodoma soils that have accumulated over tens of thousands of years and hold huge amounts of carbon and frozen under permafrost. And you can see these big wedges of ice within this landscape. And one of the big concerns in global change is if systems like this start thawing out under global warming and releasing these reserves of carbon back to the atmosphere. And that could cause an acceleration of climate change and could be a definition of dangerous climate change. So Nikita Zimov, along with myself and my colleague Dr. Mark Macias-Faria here in geography, are looking at possible ways of working in these systems to reduce the risk of carbon dioxide released from the permafrost. And one of the ideas that he's pushing here is the introduction of bison and other megafauna that used to be there 10,000 years ago and then went extinct, and the role that they can play in shifting the vegetation in a way that actually help retain the permafrost and avoid this potential carbon bomb in the Arctic. A very different example, also going back to the Pleistocene, is from my colleague Professor David Thomas, who looks at habitats in the Kalahari Desert and how humans evolved in the environment of the changing climate of southern Africa, and so looking at the evolution of humanity and under variable climate, and what this tells us about the future under variable climate as well. And this involves a range of work, ranging from archaeological excavation and geochemistry and environmental change, data from sediments, and aging of landscapes and archaeology. Again, with lots of local partners. And finally, at a more local level, my colleague Professor Heather Viles works on weathering, in particular in a variety of contexts, but in particular, a project she's had recently is looking at these statues in central Oxford, these heads that are found outside the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, and looking at the history of these heads and things, but also using the deposits of lichen and weathering on the surface of these heads to tell us about climate variability and pollution in Oxford over the last century or so. And again, using geographical insights and geographical tools to understand the environment, to understand climate in often very innovative ways. So finally, moving on to, a little bit to my own work. As I mentioned, my work has focused on rainforests in particular. More recently, it has spread to a broader interest in ecosystems and global change overall. A lot of my early work was in the Amazon in the context of climate change, understanding how the Amazon rainforest ticks and how it's changing over time, just simply discovering how the Amazon forest and its diversity work. We'd often set up forest plots in remote parts of the Amazon, identify what was going on there, often finding species of tree new to science in every forest plot that we set up. But also, as well as looking at the intact Amazon, I have a big interest in the process of change in the Amazon, how land use change is affecting it, the risk of Amazon fires, interacting with climate change, and also what can be done about that. How can we enable development in places like Brazil or other tropical countries, while also minimizing the destruction of the biosphere and the loss of biodiversity. So here there's a natural interaction between the physical geography side and the human geography side, and I'm trying to understand these processes. As part of my work, since working in the Amazon, I've also expanded the network of sites that we have to Africa. So I do a lot of work in West and Central Africa, Southern Africa, also Asia and Southeast Asia, and also in the Pacific. So we have this global network of sites where we're monitoring and understanding tropical forest and savanna ecosystems with local partners who go out there every month to collect the field data, analyze the field data. Often the students get masters and PhDs out of their own field data. So the bottom left there is a student in Peru. Bottom right, a couple of research assistants and students in Gabon, collecting our field data, using it for their own research, but also feeding into this global network that's trying to monitor how tropical forests are changing over time. And we couple that with using state-of-the-art satellite and remote sensing technology to try and understand this pattern on a larger scale. As I mentioned, a lot of this involves partnership. Everywhere we work, we go in, we establish long-term relationships with partners. On the left, that's an image from our team in Brazil. On the right, our team in Ghana. Work on training partners and students in the key skills, often sending students from one country to another. So sending students from Peru to Borneo to train others there, students from Ghana going to Gabon or to Ethiopia to train others there. So there is this lot of building capacity across the South through activities such as this. And a more local element is working, I'm not sure what's happened to my right side there, is working in the context of the UK. So a lot of our work has been about the tropics and working and understanding how we can retain biodiversity and ecology in the tropics. And one question we always have is that we're working in those landscapes, what about our landscapes in the UK at home, which are amongst the most heavily deforested landscapes on Earth, low in biodiversity, showing ongoing decline in biodiversity. How can we reverse the curve of biodiversity decline in these same landscapes, bringing back biodiversity, bringing back nature, while still getting the food and other resources we want from those landscapes. So this is an image from the Knepp estate in Sussex, where there's a lot of interest in restoring and rewilding landscapes. So another interest that we have is in this area of bringing back nature and biodiversity in the context of the UK. So to end, just a few reflections on my experience as an ethnic minority researcher in geography, and what have been the my perspectives in this in my career. And overall, I've had a very enjoyable career. I've enjoyed this subject, and I've generally a very positive experience of being an ethnic minority geographer. My own background is a British Asian. My parents were immigrants from the Indian Punjab. I grew up in Britain, and you know, what are the key points I'd say? I'd say one is around cultural expectations. As a child of Indian immigrants, the obvious question was, if you're good at school, why aren't you becoming a doctor in medicine? Why would you want to do geography? What's the point of geography? Shouldn't you be doing medicine or law? And actually, I've shown you that there's a lot of point in geography. A lot of the more fundamental challenges that we face this century are about the medicine of the planet. How do we heal a planet that's straining at the edges? And geography is centrally placed in addressing those issues. And the link to those cultural expectations is role models. So when I was looking at environmental science, there were very few Asian or Black or researchers in that field. But I hope what you see is that is changing over time. And there are people like myself and Patricia and others coming through the system that show that there is a future and there's a point in being in doing work in geography, and there's a place for ethnic minority researchers in that area. And I think there are some positives there, as we often hear about the challenges that BAME researchers face in the field. I think there are positives. I think there's a natural fluidity of cultures that coming from an ethnic minority perspective brings, an ability to understand, innate ability to understand different cultures and different perspectives and traditions. And I think that's a benefit within geography. It certainly is a benefit when working overseas and working in different environments, that naturally there's a fluidity in your own perspective. And I think it's also an advantage. Sometimes if you in context, let's say that many countries that you can work in have ambiguous colonial legacies, and actually being from a different background can often slightly diffuse any potential stereotypes or issues around coming from the UK, being British. And I think there are certainly advantages that I found in having a different ethnic and cultural identity while working in far-flung parts of the world, very far from India or from the UK. So I'd like to round off there and just say I think I've certainly had an entirely positive experience of working in this area, and I hope I've convinced you that geography is both a pivotal and an important subject for you to consider as a future subject. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Yadvinda. And I'd just like to echo what you said, because I can completely relate. I'm also British Indian, and my parents also weren't too keen on me necessarily doing geography. But the only advice I'd have to other people in a similar position is just stick in there for 3 years, and then when you come out with I'll come on to careers in a minute, and also Naveed will touch on opportunities afterwards. Then you can say I told you so afterwards. Brilliant. So I think we'll move on to the second part of the event, which is a presentation from me and Antonia. So Antonia, would you like to share your screen if possible? Okay, brilliant. So we're going to, me and Antonia are going to talk about the BAME student perspective within Oxford, and offer our personal experience as BAME geographers within the university. Next slide, please. I've already introduced myself at the beginning, but anyone who missed it, Antonia, would you like to introduce yourself?
So my name is Antonia, and I'm also coming into second year as an undergraduate in geography, and I go to Hertford College. And yeah, I'm here to help Nathan explain the importance of BAME perspectives in geography, and also just give a bit of an insight on our experience of our first year doing this degree, and at Oxford as well, to be specific.
Brilliant. Next slide, please. So we thought we'd start off by just talking a little bit about what geography means to us, and also battle some of the preconceptions that you might have about the degree. So for me, the way I define geography is the study of spatial phenomena. But what's so attractive about this is how broad the definition is and what it can encompass. Of course, the easiest and most common distinction is between human and physical geography, but I'd argue that it's so much more complex and rich than that. And within each distinction, there's obviously a huge breadth of choices, as Yavinda and Patricia have shown. Within physical geography, for example, I can talk about in our first year, topics range from climatology, geomorphology, and ecology.
What product do you want?
Sorry, I think
I would like a dog.
we just mute people. I think someone's kid's sister or brother is in the background. And on the human geography side, topics can range from post-colonial studies to feminist geography, to Marxism and financial geography. Human geography for me is not only interesting because of this diversity of themes and topics, but also because of how they relate to more relevant and contemporary topics in the 21st century. And something that was incredibly attractive for me to study geography was it's not as abstract as other topics. I don't want to name drop, but particularly history and philosophy. Even if some of the topics from afar seem quite theoretical, through the process of applying a geographical lens to it, such as economics, feminism, or race, they can quickly become more real and tangible and relatable to you and your interests. So for me personally, the topic of inequality was particularly interesting because it made so much sense to me being a low-income student. And through studying it within the geography my first year, it really helped to shape my interests. And that's what one of the modules that I'm interested in picking next year. Next slide, please. And just to, on the preconceptions, you may think that it's, or maybe there may be a stereotype of geography just being about maps and rocks, but my experience, personal experience, is that it's so much more diverse than that. In fact, one of the best aspects of it is the ability to travel, as the academics have alluded to in their talks as well. So in our first year, we got the opportunity within the first few weeks, actually, on a physical geography trip to go to Dorset, where we looked at the sand dunes and the dynamics there. We looked at what are the control factors controlling those sand dunes and that coastal landscape. And then in your second year, we'll see how it goes with COVID. There's also the opportunity, depending on whether you're a human geographer or a physical geographer, to go to Berlin and also Tenerife. So this was also something that was incredibly attractive and perhaps isn't talked about enough when thinking about applying for undergraduate. Antonia, would you like to say your understanding of geography as well?
Yeah, so for me, the most important thing I've learned about geography is that it's about connections and links. So the crux of geography is the study of spatial and temporal phenomena, but it's about the physical environment and the human world and the way that they interact. And something that I think is really pushed in the Oxford degree, which I think is a really good thing, is that they can't be extracted from each other. And that's where you get topics like climate change, where you have the effects of human societies causing big things on the physical environment, and then on the other way around, you have these effects in the physical environment are also then causing problems for human societies. And that's a theme that's kind of repeated throughout geography, because we look at cause and effect and factors, and really it's about the study of disparity and difference and inequality in processes and phenomena in space. So going back to climate change again, for example, the difference in severity of effects of sea level change. If you take low-lying islands where the effects would be quite severe in comparison to more higher up areas where the effects of sea level change might not be as bad, but the effects of other things might be worse. And so I thought I'd just kind of explain like the way that we think about things in geography by using two very different examples. So ecology, for example, this is taken from one of our first ecology lectures. We might look at why the ecology of the UK and New Zealand might be very different despite lying on similar latitudes, but for South and North, or the same for Southern South America, why they have parrots there and we don't. And yeah, and that all comes down to things like access to resources, evolutionary history, and these are all factors that have to be considered. And then in comparison, we also looked at in first year inequality in the UK, and also the idea of like the north-south divide. So this diagram isn't very good because it doesn't really show like the differences in London, and it's also quite old. But it shows a general pattern, and then we will look at why that pattern occurs, and we look at factors that come into that. So, for example, age distribution and distance to big cities, and fundamentally race. And that's just a bit of an insight of why a BAME perspective can be so invaluable. And we just put this little diagram in to show how many different topics you can look at in both human geography and physical geography, but also the importance of the fact that they're all linked, because the physical environment has impacts on the human world, and the human world has impacts on the physical environment.
Brilliant. And the other thing that we wanted to talk about quickly was one of the most surprising things about the geography degree is how many different topics there are when you jump from A-level to degree. So I just wanted to highlight some of the topics that me and Antonia found interesting. And it was under the topic of geographical controversies, which again, is not really covered within the A-level syllabus. So in the top left, you can see photos of drones. In fact, we had to do presentations about these as well. The role of drone warfare and killing at a distance, and to show both sides of the argument. And then something that's quite topical at the moment, in the top right, you can see an image of Cecil Rhodes, who was a slave owner, and he's actually in Oriel College. I don't know if he's still there. He should have been taken down by now. So we just looked at the role of those in public spaces. And some other interesting topics you can see at the bottom: geographical information systems, which is very, very relevant to the 21st century. But then other topics include the militarization of civilian society, queer development and youth in the global south. And lastly, one that's really interesting, I know is an option for second and third year: gender bias in the way academia is written, which comes on to positionality, which I'm about to. But I encourage you, I think we'll include links after this as well to the website. I thoroughly encourage you to check out the topics that we offer in Oxford. Next slide, please. And now just to talk about the main topic of today's event, which is really just talking about the value of BAME perspectives within the field. And I'd like to draw the parallel between the historical exclusion of women within geographical knowledge and research, and then also the historical exclusion of BAME perspectives. And in fact, I was reading, for my collections or my exams next term, it was only until the late 1900s, really, that the role of women in geographical academia specifically became acknowledged and incorporated and appreciated as geographical knowledge. And there's been quite a rapid change in the small number of decades that followed. In fact, now between 2017 and 2019, the 3-year average, there was 58% of the undergraduate admissions were women. And that affects how you think about issues, right? And I think it's long overdue then to include and acknowledge in the same way BAME perspectives and BAME people into the field. And to draw upon a geographical concept that we've learned about in first year, which is the idea of gaze of the world, which is essentially the fact that your identity, or your positionality rather, influences the way that you experience the world, and therefore influences, of course, the way that you think about it. And therefore, historically, if academics have been from a particular gender or particular ethnicity, it influences how we think about issues. And so I just point to the fact that there's so much value in diversifying academia and geography specifically, because it affects how we think about important issues. Antonia?
So yeah, I would just reiterate the same point, but saying specifically in human geography, you can't really consider anything without considering race and gender and class, and you can't really understand spatial and temporal patterns without considering all these factors. So having a BAME perspective is often an invaluable resource because it allows those perspectives to never be forgotten and intersectionality to always be important. And again, coming back to gaze, it's something I found personally quite interesting in the way that we look at race as often like a lens or an angle with which to look at an issue, when for me and other non-white students, it's more like our lived reality. So it's always important to add more BAME perspectives so that that idea can be more at the forefront rather than another consideration. And then in physical geography, BAME perspectives are also invaluable, which kind of touches on what, going back to what Yavinda was saying about how a lot of the time the study of physical geography will be from people who travel to new areas to then study, whereas it makes a lot of sense to boost the study of BAME perspectives from a lot of the time, especially because a lot of the time the areas that are undergoing rapid physical change at the moment from climate change are in subtropical and equatorial regions. So it makes sense to boost literature and academics who are from these areas, who understand more intimately the communities and the way that they're going to be affected. So BAME perspectives really do become invaluable at all parts of geography in order to get a full picture of what's going on and to understand, yeah.
Brilliant. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up, before we pass over to Naveed, we just want to quickly touch on geography specifically at Oxford and what was attractive and valuable there. So one of the aspects is the choice in modules when you get into your second and third years is incredibly diverse. As well, to compound that, the amazing field trips that I mentioned, obviously Berlin and Tenerife, fingers crossed we get to go there this academic year. And I would be lying if I didn't say the reputation of Oxford wasn't something that affected my decision to come here. The quality of the teaching is incredibly rigorous. In fact, the tutorial system, for anyone who doesn't know, is a very personal and interactive way of teaching, where one academic will meet with their students a maximum of usually 3, at least once a week, and set an essay and talk through your ideas. It's actually the soft skills as well that you learn through that process of learning to articulate yourself in these tutorials that is also invaluable and helps me to do things like the event today. And Antonia, did you have anything to add about Geography Oxford?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that the diversity of the Oxford Geography degree is something that makes it so attractive. Even in first year, even though Nathan was talking about the choice of modules in second and third year, in first year, we get to study such a wide range of topics. We get to study both physical and human geography. And from that, you get to learn different kind of skills. So for different essays, you might learn more technical and scientific writing, or then you might learn more humanities style essay writing for a human essay. And it's just a great opportunity as well with tutorials to get a lot of feedback and to have these really interesting conversations with your tutors, but also other people like your colleagues at college. There'll also be people who are really passionate and who really love the subject. So it's just a great opportunity to have these informed discussions with people who really care about your subject.
Brilliant. And the last slide that we have is just about careers, because I can see a few people have asked questions in the chat. One of the benefits of a geography degree is that there's so many options after you graduate. In fact, a lot of employers really like to employ geographers because of the vast range of skills that they have. As I mentioned, geographical information systems, so the opportunity to learn coding. And this list that you can see on the slide basically shows the range of destinations from geographers from the years 2000 to 2013. And as you can see, even if you wanted to go in a more vocational thing like law, Yavinda mentioned parental pressure, such as that. There's still the opportunity to study what you love, geography, and still go into that at the end. So nothing's off the table with the geography degree. And there, I think we'll leave it, and that's a brilliant way to segue into our alumnus, Naveed. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and Naveed, I think you're logged in as no one get started. And there's not 2 Nathans. Just I sent you the link that I had, so you appear as me.
Okay, I don't mind that. Hi everyone, I'm Naveed. Thanks for the intro, and yeah, really fascinating to actually hear all those discussions. So I have tying into the BAME theme. I have a Pakistani background. From the Pakistani side of Punjab is where my parents came from, so opposite side of the border to Yavinda's parents. And I was born and grew up in Manchester, and yeah, studied at Oxford between 2004 and 2007. So Patricia definitely I know was around then, I believe. Yavinda may have been as well, but I can't quite recall. But yeah, it was great to hear those talks. Also lovely to hear about the West African travels, which is my favorite part of the world. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I think also good to hear about how the course is today. So, you know, a lot of the points that that Nathan and Antonia made were really prevalent in my own decision making. And I'm really glad that the course still allows you to explore human and physical geography, because that was a significant factor in my decision making back then. And you know, it's great that it remains that way, because not every geography course allows you that diversity. So I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a few slides prepared, and I will try and bring those up. Okay, so as Nathan mentioned, I am going to talk about careers, and just talk about my journey from obviously being here at Oxford to where I am today. So just a very high level overview, just to give you context in terms of my journey since being at Oxford. So came down from Manchester, studied geography for 3 years. I then went into investment banking, where I spent about 9 years. And I worked at Lehman Brothers for a year from 2007, and then joined Nomura, which was a Japanese investment bank. Really interesting time to be working in the industry. I got involved in a huge number of transactions, nearly $40 billion worth of deals over that period. And I left banking in around 2016 and started to really explore the early stage kind of technology and venture capital ecosystem. And that's where I am today. So just in terms of my current role, very quickly, I'm really happy to say that, you know, this is the one of the first roles where I use not only the techniques that I learned in my geography course, but really brought out some of the content as well. So I currently run what we call an accelerator, which effectively is a program of support for early stage technology companies. And the technology companies that I support are all focused on tackling climate change and developing solutions to do so. So I'm based in London at the moment, based out of Imperial College, although that might be changing next year. But that's where I'm based at the moment, and effectively supporting what we call pre-seed companies, so companies that haven't raised any investment yet, but are technology companies that are building a solution that might be tackling climate change. So to give you some examples, you know, we're supporting a company called Hydrocotton at the moment, which is a startup that is growing cotton in greenhouses using 95% less water than is typically used in the field. We're supporting a company called the Shellworks, which is creating alternative plastics from shellfish waste. Another example is a company we are supporting called Breathe Battery Technologies, which is using advanced artificial intelligence to optimize the way batteries perform and thereby help the EV transition take place. So a huge variety of different companies that we work with, which is ultimately what makes the job really enjoyable. But also knowing that each company in its own way is tackling the climate crisis makes it feel like a very worthwhile position to be in. So just going back a little bit, I won't spend too much time on this because it's been covered in the talk before, but very briefly, in terms of my decision making, in terms of why I picked geography, one of the factors was what was I good at. So similar to what Yadvinda and Nathan have said, you know, I come from a cultural background where geography is not something you are encouraged to aspire to necessarily. But also I realized, you know, probably by the time I did GCSEs, that science was not my strong point. So going down that road and trying to study chemistry or medicine or something like that would have meant ultimately I probably would not have done very well. So I thought about what am I good at, and geography was the standout subject in terms of my performance. Where should I study? Again, there were a huge number of questions here, and ultimately I ended up picking a balance between courses that offered human and physical geography, but I did have a bias towards human just because I didn't study any science A levels. All of that doesn't always preclude you from doing that. But the appeal about the Oxford course, as I mentioned, was I could still incorporate physical geography into my studies. And then risky, that was a question which came to mind in terms of careers. It might be something that some of you are feeling at the moment as well. And what I mean by that is, you know, I wasn't aware at the time as to what a geography degree might lead to. So I didn't know if I was, you know, going to end up unemployed, or if I was going to have fewer opportunities than someone who studied law or business or medicine, for example. So that did come into my mind to some degree. But at the same time, it was countered by the idea that I would be able to keep my options open. So because geography is such a broad degree, and you're not necessarily identified in a specific way, in the way that you know, a medic would be, or a you know, an economist might be, or dentistry might allude to people perceiving that kind of degree. Geography, I think, is broad enough such that, you know, you can go and literally do what you want in many ways after you graduate. So that was again another factor. And finally, there was the question of representation, which I've kind of touched on before. But you know, a question of, was this the right degree for me to do in terms of, you know, representation for people like me? But ultimately, you know, I decided that this was a subject I enjoyed, I wanted to do, and so I was going to try and study it. There's no other reason in my mind to not go ahead with it. So, you know, how did I then kind of make that transition into work? And, you know, what would I encourage you as students to think about when you go to university? So any pre-university experience that you have is fantastic, and, you know, you should build on that, and, you know, always mention that when you're going for university and thinking about your first job, especially if it's something that might be relevant to what you want to do as a full-time career. Any informal experience that you might gain along the way. So even while you're at university, you know, are there things that you can do in your spare time? Granted, at Oxford, you know, you have a heavy workload. You know, I think I had 3 essays every 2 weeks to do, and there was a lot of reading to do alongside that. So, you know, there's not a huge amount of time to do other things. But having said that, often the students who do best at university, not just Oxford, are those that are best at managing their time. And, you know, if you manage your time effectively, then there's no reason why you can't do, you know, informal experience for other startups that you might come across, supporting some of your academics in some of the work that they're doing, supporting PhD students, or other type of, you know, I guess, experience away from the degree that you can get while you're at university. Quickly brings me on to societies. So, you know, that's also a good way to gain kind of what I would describe as real world experience and exposure. A lot of those societies will give you exposure to outside people. I guess this is a good example where Nathan reached out to me. Although I'm an Oxford graduate, I'm not part of the university anymore, but, you know, Nathan will interact with other people like me, also people who are not part of the university. And, you know, just joining societies gets you that exposure, and I think it's very, very useful to have. And it would also get you exposure to other parts of the university. So again, just maybe talking about this from a BAME perspective, I think it's very easy to go into an environment where you are a minority potentially, and then stick closely to others that are like you, because, you know, you're a minority together in a way. And while I think that's helpful, and I think it makes life more comfortable, and I think it's fantastic when there are other people similar to you around you, I think it's also important to develop exposure outside of that immediate circle as well. So, you know, I was part of various societies which, you know, I used to attend talks in the Pakistani society, used to go along to the African society. I would attend talks in other areas as well, and that just exposed me to different types of people. But importantly, I think also expose those people to people like me. So that's something I encourage, but it will naturally happen. I think in that way. And then internships, again, they're hugely useful and important to do if you can get them. It's something you do have to start thinking of ahead of time. I didn't even realize internships were a word. I didn't know internships existed when I went to university. The only reason I heard about them was in Oxford, second and third year lectures are often taken jointly. And when I went to my first lectures in second year, there were students from the third year who were talking about their summer internship experiences. And I realized I needed to get some. I then went and applied to lots of places. And getting that internship was really crucial because I then got a full-time offer at the end of it to join banking full-time. And then network, and that's something that is going to be consistently repeated throughout my brief talk. But one thing I've learned, and I didn't fully grasp while I was at university, is the importance of networking and your network. So whenever you get opportunities to meet new people, whether they're part of your course, whether they're part of other courses, whether they're part of other universities, whether they're academics, whether they're students, whether they're full-time working professionals, whenever you have an opportunity to go and meet someone, either in a one-on-one format or in a group that, does something of interest to you or might have knowledge that is relevant to you, try and take up that opportunity, because you never know where, you might get useful advice. You never know where that connection might be helpful. And I think talking about this from a Black and minority ethnic perspective, those networks are maybe less open in some ways, or less well established in terms of what you might go through. For me, there was no one I even knew who ever went to Oxford. There was no one I ever knew who went to banking. I didn't even know anyone in London. So, if you can get exposure to people who have experience in other forms of life and society, then you should really try and take those opportunities up. Very quickly, how did geography help? I'm not going to spend too long on this because I think the points were touched really effectively in Nathan and Tony's talk. But a variety of subject matter, which they touched upon, the qualitative and quantitative aspect of the degree. At Oxford, I remember we did a module in the first year on statistical methods, which was really important in giving me some technical tools on analysis and kind of data processing effectively. But also the qualitative side is obviously really well developed through the essays that you do. Fantastic skills to have when you go into the world of work. The variety of subject matter, again, really helpful because it opens lots of different doors. Teamwork, so Nathan's alluded to the field work and field trips that you do. They give you a lot of experience in working in teams, which again is a fantastic experience. And then again, as was alluded to in the previous talk, geography is about the real world. You learn about how the world works, both from a physical and a human perspective, and the interactions between the two. And I think that gives you a wide kind of perspective when you go into the world of work. And I mentioned climate change at the end very, very specifically because traditionally, at least when I did my degree, it was largely taught in the physical context, but obviously has massive human implications as well. But as you will all have seen, like the world is becoming increasingly focused on climate change, and frankly, it has to. And wherever you study geography, if you do indeed study geography, if you're thinking about what is going to be helpful for you in terms of future options, then if you have opportunities to delve into climate change deeply, then in terms of at least specific subject matter, that will be potentially the most useful when it comes to the way the world of work is changing today.
Brilliant. Just to say, we're approaching the time now to go into questions.
Sure. Shall I stop sharing screen?
How much have you got left? Is this the last slide?
Yes, so the last page, and the last page was discussion, really.
Okay, cool.
So I'll be another minute, potentially. So very quickly, when I graduated, like the traditional options I mentioned on the left were the main ones that people talked about when it came to what you do with a geography degree. I'd say a whole load of new options have opened up since I graduated. You know, becoming an entrepreneur in this space, they're the types of people I work with every day. The green finance and investment space has grown massively. So when I went into banking, that's not something I was able to do. But if you wanted to go into banking, you could bring your degree to your work nowadays. Corporate sustainability, those examples at the bottom of the page are huge areas of growth, and every major corporate will, I am sure, at least every publicly listed major corporate, if they don't have it already, will have sustainability teams in place within the next 5 years. And if you don't want to work for a corporate, consulting is a way where you're outside of those major corporates, but you work with them and educate them on what's happening with climate change. So I will leave it there. I think I had some points of general discussion, but these I think will come out through what I've said already, and maybe also the questions that we come to.
Hey, thank you so much, Naveed. That was incredibly insightful. So just to end, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers. I'd like to pay tribute to them for paving the way for us younger generations and showing, serving as examples of what BAME academics and can achieve and study, but also to Naveed for joining us and offering examples of what can be achieved in terms of careers. And also, of course, thank you to Antonia for joining me in this and helping show the BAME student perspective. And last but not least, of course, thank you to Claire for helping to co-host and organise what's been, I think, a very helpful event. So I think we'll leave it there. Speakers, if you should stay on while everyone else leaves the call. And thanks again for everyone for joining.